We have Net Insight, also two speakers. And the first one is Doug Shelton, who's head of technical engineering for the Americas. He has been involved in the design and implementation of terrestrial networks since the mid of '80s, even though he has commissioned his first IP routers in a pre-mature phase. And we have Mikael Wånggren, who's an experienced software engineer working on the internet media transport product line and currently involved in the standardization efforts in the field of broadcast media internet transport. So the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. So I'm Doug Shelton. We're going to talk a little bit about using the cloud for media transport, and specifically really looking at some of the challenges that come with live broadcast and live ingest in the cloud. So we'll talk a little bit about the shift to cloud. We'll talk about live contribution in the cloud, which is a little bit different than some of the things that we heard in the previous two presentations. A lot of what I thought I heard was oriented towards production and some of the non-real-time things and processes and workflows it takes to assemble a finished product, which may be very different with an episodic show than it is with a live broadcast. We'll talk about some of the features and functions of the different protocols that are oriented towards live broadcast, and we'll give a quick introduction as to the protocols that are emerging towards live broadcast. Then I'm going to turn it over to Mikael, who has actually had some good, solid, hands-on technical experience with these emerging protocols. So just to get us started, a quick show of hands in the audience. Anybody who has ever thought about moving part of their workflow to the cloud, raise your hand, please. Lots of hands going up. Okay, keep them up, keep them up. Put your hands down if you have not done it. Keep them up if you are already using cloud resources. Good. Now keep your hands up if you've never, ever, ever, ever had any problem transmitting anything into or through or out of the cloud. Okay, there's my first point. The cloud is a great tool for expanding broadcast and expanding the way that we change our production, everything from a financial model to the kinds of workflows that we can do. One of the challenges, though, is that getting content to and from the cloud is more and more critical. And it's not just to and from the cloud. Anyone who has worked in a cloud environment, especially if you're not able to land everything in the same cloud instance or the same data center, knows that getting things through the cloud may also be as challenging as getting in and out. So integrity is key when moving to a cloud-based workflow. That then asks the next question: why do we need to think about error correction in a cloud environment? Well, the first thing we know about IP is underlying, it is the protocol that has made this cloud transformation possible. And the first thing you know about IP as a protocol is that when it detects an error, it has only one thing it can do. It will throw it away. And it's up to upper layers and other protocols to make up and correct for those errors. And so that's fine. Our transmission infrastructures, the networks, have become more and more error-free over time. You often hear about 5 nines reliability, and even better than that. But if you stop and think about it, 5 nines reliability means that you're going to have an error every 2 minutes in your broadcast. That's not acceptable. I wouldn't want that to happen if that 2.5-minute point happened to be the winning kick of the last match of the World Cup or the final touchdown of the Super Bowl. And because you can't predict when that's going to happen, you have to be able to correct for it. So what are the protocols that are available to correct for issues in cloud environments, in moving things to and from the cloud? Historically, there have been a lot. We started with things going all the way back to satellite, using things like Reed-Solomon. Yes, I am that old. Sorry, folks. We started with things like Reed-Solomon error correction, for forward error correction. We started with SMPTE working together as we put together compressed workflows, the SMPTE COP3 matrix forward error correction was a big leap forward, especially when we were in well-managed network environments. Now, as we see people moving more and more towards the public internet, starting 5 years ago, 7 years ago, you started to see a variety of proprietary solutions that emerged. It seems like if you go back 2 years, every booth that you went to in the South Hall at the NAB show, there was somebody else showing you a way to put video across the internet. There were all of these proprietary solutions. So what's happened really in the last couple of years is there's been a realization that the world is not going to live in a cloud environment if everybody has their own proprietary protocol that you have to use to interoperate in that space. And so there are two real emerging open standards. The first, SRT, predominantly developed by Haivision, and very wisely, I think, made available to other providers, has achieved pretty wide acceptance. The second is RIST, the Reliable Internet Stream Transport Protocol, that grew out of the desire to have a true open source, not just protocol that's openly distributed, but now an open source collaborative protocol developed for the needs of real-time broadcast. So SRT has gotten good, strong acceptance. A variety of vendors have placed it into their products. RIST is a little bit newer. It's growing, and it's growing rapidly. One of the differences, I think, between the two is if you look at the people who have accepted RIST and joined the RIST forum, you get companies like Evertz, like Nevion, like NetInsight, companies that, when you think about real-time broadcast contribution, they're the names that may come to your head first. And that's where RIST is really coming to the fore. So what are the differences at a very high level? By the way, this slide was current, or as current as we could make it as of IBC. It is based on RIST 1.4, which was unveiled, I'm sorry, SRT 1.4, which was unveiled at IBC 2019. And RIST main profile, RIST simple profile is already ratified. RIST main profile is literally due any day now. There was a working committee meeting, I think just this morning, right? Yep. So it is, the draft is ready to be presented and voted on by the standards. So what are the real differences between the two? If you look back a year or two ago, there were some pretty big differences. And what we're starting to see is both SRT and RIST are converging towards a common set of real goals for transmission. Probably the biggest differences between them are in null packet compression, which is basically a way of taking out unnecessary packets in a transport stream and then reinserting them at the end. SRT does not include that. RIST does. Security, a different approach to security. RIST uses DTLS and with pre-shared key as a fallback, whereas SRT uses PSK. And then the last one, and this is a critical piece, is service reliability. What do I mean by that? Service reliability is the way that you can use, if you have it available, multiple networks or multiple paths to ensure that the video transport stream does make it across the network. So if you've got one path and one path only, you don't have a service reliability mechanism. It's hard to beat an air gap. If that's down, it's down. If you have the ability to distribute your traffic across multiple links or do intelligent failover and handle a failover situation, it helps you improve the reliability of real time. So that's a real very brief background. What I'd like to do now is turn it over to Mikael, who has had some good, solid hands-on with all of these protocols and can tell us about the differences. Go for it.
It's the green?
It's the green one.
OK, thank you. So before we dive into the performance measurements, first let's have a look at this thing that is commonly only known as ARQ in the business. And so as a concept, what is it? Well, in broad strokes, it is a transmission mechanism that uses UDP with sequence numbers, and a receiver that selectively requests retransmissions of only missing packets. So what would that look like in reality? Well, if you have a sender and a receiver, then the sender will be sending a continuous stream. It will never stop and wait. So let's say one of these packets is dropped in transit. The receiver will notice this by seeing the hole in the sequence number chain, and it will construct a NAC packet, which is a not acknowledgement, so it can request a copy. And the sender sends the copy, all the while keep sending its stream. So that's easy enough, right? Well, let's look at some fine print, which has bearings for the rest of this presentation. So this is not a guaranteed delivery mechanism. An attempt is made to recover packets, but it's not guaranteed. The receiver implements a latency buffer, and its job is to hold the entire stream for a fixed amount of time so as to allow for multiple iterations of NACs and retransmissions. So a typical size of a latency buffer would be something like 4 to 7 round trip times, which should give you 4 to 7 retransmission attempts. But if your packet is not recovered by the time that it's its turn to be paced out, then the packet will not be in the final stream. We want a fixed end-to-end latency because we want the system to appear transparent. We want the timing on the input to be replicated exactly on the output. This is to get a legal transport stream with regards to PCRs and such, and to ease clock recovery and not blow decoder buffers. This is a hardware decoder. The receiver notices that it needs to ask for retransmissions based on inconsistencies in the sequence number chain, and reordering will do the same thing. So we need to have some resiliency to reordering, but this is a trade-off because there's the more resilience you have, the higher penalty you take in form of latency for the first miss for a certain packet. You may find that you want to aggregate sets or ranges of retransmission requests into single NAC packets for various reasons. But also, again, this is a trade-off because the more information you stick into one NAC packet, the more information you lose if you lose one of these packets, which will happen. And finally, to complicate things, SRT actually does acknowledgements as well. My view of this is that the NACs actually do the majority of the work when it comes to retransmissions. The AX is more of a bookkeeping feature. So, diving into the performance evaluation. So we wanted to evaluate how one specific RIST implementation did compared to SRT. You should note that since SRT is a specification, you will have different implementations with different performance. But now we're looking at SRT 134 versus GStreamer RIST, which will be in GStreamer 118. It's already in mainline, and this is an open source implementation. So we also included a commercially available solution as a baseline only, just to see what a mature ARQ solution would do. And that is the key here. This is ARQ features only, so it doesn't use any FEC or anything like that. So, test setup. We had a sender node and a receiver node, and we were sending 7 megabits per second constant bit rate MPEG transport stream containing H.264 video and some audio. And we protected this using SRT or RIST or this reference protocol. And the common denominator is a latency buffer of 200 milliseconds, or 4 times average round trip time. And in the reverse channel, we have the NACs. So to this, we add an impairment device. So that's an ANUI hardware network emulator, and it allows us to emulate transmission delay with jitter. So the jitter profile is something that ANUI calls a internet distribution, basically a long tail distribution. And there's no reordering added here. We do bandwidth limitation at 10 or 8 megabits per second. And finally, we do packet drops. We could do many different kinds of distributions, but we mostly want to look at bursty drops modeled by a Poisson distribution to mimic real-world infinite behavior. So initial results. Well, our very first tests were with periodic drops and only in the forward direction, where we could find that we couldn't really see any difference of the three protocols. They were all doing perfectly or almost perfectly up to the point where the retransmission bandwidth saturated the link, where you can't really do anything more than there. We could see that SRT saturated the link a little bit earlier than the other ones, but other than that, no difference. But it's more interesting to look at the bursty drops. So as a first chart, first let's have a look at the axis here, because this one will return several times. So on the x-axis, you have a line drop rate. That is the drop rate enforced by the impairment device. And that is long-term averages. So on a short-term average, on the size of a latency buffer window, those will actually be substantially higher. So don't focus too much about the numbers. Mostly look at the comparison of different protocols. On the y-axis, you have the residual drop rates. So that is defined in the context of the content stream. So that is the missing packets in the final content stream divided by the total number of packets in the content stream. And I should also say that we sampled at increments of 2% line drop rates, and these are all averages of 4 runs of 15 minutes each. So for this chart, this is drops in the forward direction only. This is 7 megabits content in 10 megabits channel, and latency buffer of 4 times RTT. And we can see that SRT is doing the best. It's the red line there in the bottom. It's doing perfectly or almost perfectly up to and including 12% line drop rate. The reference is doing not quite as good, and the GSM RIST is not doing very well at all in comparison. So based on this, you might conclude that SRT is the way to go, right? Well, let's look a little bit further before we decide. So if you're having drops in the forward direction, depending on why you're seeing drops, you might find that you get drops in the reverse direction as well. So we want to look at this case as well. So here we can see that now the reference is actually on par with the GSM RIST, but SRT is actually doing better still, especially down there in the low residual drop rate range close to the x-axis, which is really where you want to be. I mean, as Doug showed in the other slides, if you're up there on the right side at 1% packet drop rates, and this is H.264 video, it's going to be completely unwatchable. So what do you do then? Well, you probably want to increase your latency buffer size, right? So here we doubled the size of latency buffer, and it's 400 milliseconds, or 8 times RTT. And first of all, we can look on the scale of the y-axis. You can see that it went way down, so this is helping all the protocols. But more importantly, we can see that now RIST is the one doing the best. So the key takeaway from this slide, I think, is there's no silver bullet here. Depending on the specifics of your use case, we will have different recommendations for protocols. So know your use case and know which other use cases you might transition into. And also remember that different RIST implementations will have different performance. Yeah. So we also wanted to dig down into why do we even see a performance difference. So this is the case from the last slide where the symmetric drops, 7 megabits content in 10 megabits stream, and SRT was doing better than the other two, right? Well, why is this? So we use Wireshark, which is a network analysis and capture tool, to look at the patterns of retransmission requests and retransmissions. And for a latency buffer size of 4 times RTT, you would expect to see, in average, 4 retransmission attempts. But for GSM RIST, we saw up to 3. And that is because you have the jitter and you have the reorder resiliency. And GSM RIST was a bit conservative as to deciding that a packet is probably gone and needs to be retransmitted. So It got maybe 3.7, 3.8 attempts into the size of a latency buffer, which of course is only 3, because there's no point in requesting another retransmission if it's not going to come back in time. For SRT, we saw that they got 7, which is a bit unexpected because you would think 4 is a maximum. So when we start looking at it, it's actually quite simple. So this is a capture of the SRT sender side. And it's one original packet, and it's 4 retransmissions, and then it's recovered. And if you look at the pacing of the retransmissions, you can see that they actually go out at a pace of half an RTT. So they see they have a missing packet, they send out a retransmission, and then they send out another one before they have any idea of if the previous one was a success or a fail. So this is speculative retransmissions, which of course is a great way to get more attempts into a fixed size buffer, but it will drive duplicates, it will drive bandwidth overhead. Now, I'm not saying it's the SRT algorithm is just send everything in double pace. I'm sure it's much more complicated than that, but I'm saying the superior performance in this use case is mainly due to getting more attempts in there. So let's have a look at how much more bandwidth they're actually using. So up here on the right, you can see this is the sender bandwidth on the y-axis. It's a broken y-axis, so it starts at 5. And the black dotted line, that is the original content at 7 megabits. So the difference between this line and the lines above, that is retransmission bandwidth. So we can see that for any given line drop rates, we have SRT actually using double the amount of retransmission bandwidth. And this is a trade-off here because this extra bandwidth could have been used for better codec quality. So they're trading video codec quality for retransmission recovery, which could be a very good trade-off, but just know that it's there. And I should also say that GStream and RIST does not do these speculative retransmissions, but there's nothing in the spec that says you cannot do it. In fact, the spec says that it's up to the implementer to decide how to do congestion control or sender bitrate throttling or retransmission request scheduling policies. So you could do it the way that SRT does it. You could do it on only the last packet. You could do it any other intelligent way. But all of these add complexity. And as we know, adding complexity tends to add to the risk of getting undesirable and unexpected corner cases. So we did see a couple of undesirable corner cases for SRT. One of them you can read about in our paper. It has to do with when we added a TCP-based file transfer in the same constricted channel. So I encourage you to go read the paper. The other one I can show you here. It is, what if your 10 megabits channel is not 10 megabits? What if it's 8? So now we can see that for 6% line drop rate, the residual drop rate for SRT takes a huge jump up to 7.5. So we're actually losing packets by attempting recovery. And why is this? Well, going to the sender bandwidth graph again, we can see that it's a correspondingly huge jump there. And this is also the place we could see in the bandwidth limiter that it started dropping packets. So basically, this is a classic congestion collapse. SRT does have settings for limiting the maximum output bandwidth, which in theory should help you to place yourself below these 8 megabits and avoid this congestion collapse. But yeah, I should also say that the other protocols do hit this bandwidth limit as well, eventually, but at a much later stage on the x-axis, and it doesn't appear to be quite as harsh either. So, but back to the limiting on the SRT. So even if you could set your maximum output bandwidth, it's not entirely uncomplicated because A, you would have to know what your worst case channel bandwidth is over the course of months, say, if this is a 24/7 connection. And B, the worst case tend to vary over the course of the day. So you would be optimizing for worst case, which gives suboptimal behavior for the rest of the day. So there's no free lunch there. I mean, there's a trade-off. I think it's time for us to summarize. So as broadcasters are moving their production workflows into the cloud, unmanaged networks are becoming a part of the end-to-end production environment, and this drives the need for ARQ solutions. From a features and functions perspective, SRT and RIST are rapidly converging. From a performance perspective, we saw that one major factor was how to do your retransmission scheduling, where SRT, by being aggressively speculative, provided a better recovery rate at the expense of higher bandwidth and increased complexity. And finally, there is a substantial investment in proprietary protocols out there. That's not going to go away anytime soon. So, but as this market has been maturing over the last 10 years or so, we've seen the need for interoperability arise, and especially in the case for cloud ingest, where major cloud providers are not going to build easy-to-use cloud ingest for all of these proprietary protocols. So SRT and RIST offer interoperable solutions to rally around there. We don't see any of these two winning out and being the only solution anytime soon. Just look at the way that different major cloud providers seems to be coming down on different sides of this. So we see the need for vendors to support both of these for the foreseeable future, at least. Yeah. And that is all we had. Thank you.
So are there any questions in the room? There's one.
Here comes one. Harvey.
Yes, hello. I'm Harvey Arnold from Sinclair Broadcast Group. How do you feel about when you're using this technology and you're switching between public and private networks? Are you envisioning in the future that you're going to have an agent that will tell you which is the best system to use, or how would you make that decision? Because presently today, what we see a big variability. It may be very, very good, and then it's not.
Yeah.
And we're always looking for the best system to use, and it's really frustrating for users, broadcast users especially. We only get one try out to the public.
Right.
And that's perplexing.
Thank you, Harvey. That's a great observation and a great question. That is one of the fundamental differences that I outlined earlier between SRT in its current state and RIST main profile. That difference is what I called service reliability. You might hear it described as resilience. You may also hear it described as simply being able to use multiple paths or load sharing, something like that. It's important if you're going to be operating in an environment where you have the option of both public and private networks to be able to measure the behavior of both of those paths, ideally utilize both of them, and then have the protocol that you choose be able to make an intelligent decision about which one is performing better, and simply take the traffic off of that and move back and forth seamlessly as the traffic changes, because the traffic will change. And so some implementations, RIST main profile in particular, are taking that into, as well as some of the proprietary ones, have taken that into account. So it's important as you look at that to make sure that that service reliability is included. Thank you. You get that right? Yeah. Okay.
Your testing showed 25 milliseconds of network latency with uptick to 8 times for buffer delay, correct? Mm-hmm. Did you test, and can you speak to anything at a higher latency of 100 or 200 milliseconds, such as doing international contribution?
Yeah, absolutely. We did some of those tests as well. And that is one of those cases where we saw unexpected results, where just by sticking to the 4 times RTT, but going to 100 milliseconds round trip time instead of 50, you could see that RIST was doing on par with SRT. And that's not something that I really had time to dig into why. I didn't expect it to be that way, but yeah.
Thank you.
Zaydan from Cine Media. RIST allows bonding, and you can have redundancy. Also, you can have FEC together with ARQ. How do you compare now RIST with all these features with SRT? Thank you.
How do I compare RIST with what?
Yeah, RIST with all these features, bonding, retransmission, which will reduce the needs for ARQ, and SRT without these features.
Okay. Yeah, so SRT with 1.4 actually came out with a FEC as well. So they have had FEC since September. And apparently they're working on bonding as well. So the target is IBC 2020 for release for their bonding. But at the moment, yeah, I would say that the ability to do bonding or 1+1 is really what I guess would drive RIST being more of a broadcast standard than a consumer-facing standard.
Yeah, and that's especially important if you are going to have multiple transmission paths available.
Okay. Thank you.
Wonderful. Then
Great.
I think we're done for the session.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.